Welcome to Heartline Stories. What would you do if a stranger's plea turned your world upside down? Today, you'll witness an unforgettable moment, one filled with desperation, hope, and unspoken promises. A simple question shook two lives forever. Madam, do you have a baby? Stay tuned as the story unfolds, revealing emotions so raw they'll leave you breathless. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that tug at your heartstrings. What do you think of this intro? Shall we tweak it or refine it further? The morning sun poured its golden light onto the quiet streets of Greenville. Margaret Price was walking home from the farmer's market, her basket filled with apples, bread, and a jar of honey. Her bright scarf flapped gently in the wind as she turned the corner near the old library. As she approached the park, Margaret noticed a little boy sitting on a bench. He couldn't have been older than 6. His brown hair was messy, and his small face looked pale. His tiny hands clutched a worn baby blanket, and there, wrapped in the blanket, was an infant, a baby boy, no more than 5 months old. The baby's cheeks were red, and his cries tugged at her heart. Margaret stopped, feeling her chest tighten. She knelt in front of the boy and asked softly, "Hi there, sweetheart. Are you okay?" The boy looked up with wide, scared eyes. "Madam, do you have a baby?" he asked in a trembling voice. Margaret was taken aback by the question but shook her head gently. "No, honey, I don't. Why do you ask?" she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. The boy took a shaky breath and held out the baby closer to her. "Please take my brother. He's 5 months old, and he's hungry. I can't take care of him anymore." Margaret's heart broke into pieces. "Where's your mom or dad, sweetie? Do they know you're here?" she asked, trying not to cry. The boy shook his head. "Mom left us, and Dad hasn't come back since yesterday. We waited, but my brother cried all night. I gave him the last bit of milk we had. I don't know what to do," he said, tears streaming down his cheeks. Margaret sat down beside the boy and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been very brave to take care of your brother," she said, "but you're not alone anymore. I'm going to help you, okay? What's your name?" "Logan," the boy whispered. "His name is Charlie." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't just leave them here, and calling the police felt cold and impersonal. These boys needed comfort and care, not fear. She offered Logan a warm smile. "Logan, why don't we find some food for Charlie? I have apples and bread. We'll figure this out together." Logan hesitated but nodded slowly. Margaret gently took Charlie into her arms. His crying softened as he felt the warmth of her touch. Logan held on to Margaret's scarf tightly as they walked toward a nearby cafe. Margaret knew this was just the beginning of their journey, her mind filled with questions. How had these boys ended up so alone, and who could help them find safety and love again? For now, though, she focused on being their anchor in the storm, one step at a time. Margaret guided Logan and Charlie into a cozy cafe down the street. The scent of fresh pastries and brewing coffee filled the air, and the warmth of the cafe was a welcome change from the chilly breeze outside. Margaret found a quiet corner table and set her basket down. "Sit here, Logan," she said, pulling out a chair for him. "Let me get something for you and Charlie to eat." Logan looked nervous but did as he was told. Margaret approached the counter and ordered a warm bowl of oatmeal for Logan, along with a small bottle of milk and a soft roll for Charlie. As she waited, she noticed the barista, a kind-looking woman named Linda, watching the boys with concern. "Are those your children?" Linda asked softly. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. No, they're not, but that they need help. I'm just trying to figure out how to help them. Linda frowned but nodded. Let me know if you need anything. I can warm up some milk for the baby if you'd like. Thank you, Margaret said, grateful for the kindness. She carried the food back to the table and placed it in front of Logan. Here you go, sweetheart. Eat slowly, it's nice and warm, she said, gently patting his back. She carefully held Charlie, who was now looking around with wide, curious eyes. Margaret fed him small bits of the soft roll dipped in the milk, and for the first time the baby stopped fussing. As Logan ate, Margaret leaned in and asked, Logan, do you know where you live? Do you have any family nearby? Logan shook his head as he swallowed a bite of oatmeal. We used to live in the greenhouse on Maple Street, he said quietly. But after Mom left, Dad said we couldn't stay there. We've been moving around since then. Sometimes he comes back, but not always. Margaret's heart ached. She didn't want to alarm Logan, but it was clear they couldn't go on like this. She needed to find a way to get them proper care and a safe place to stay. Yet she didn't want to make Logan feel like he was losing control of his situation. Logan, I promise you this. I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you or Charlie. We're going to figure this out together, she said firmly. Logan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. Are you sure? He asked. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his small hand. Absolutely sure. But deep down, she knew the road ahead would be challenging. Margaret had no idea what twists and turns lay in store, but she was determined not to let these boys face them alone. As she sat there, holding Charlie and reassuring Logan, she silently vowed to give them the safety and love they so desperately needed. Margaret stayed at the table with Logan and Charlie, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The cafe bustled quietly around them, customers chatting, cups clinking, but all Margaret could think about was keeping these boys safe. Logan, do you remember any phone numbers or names of people your family knows? She asked gently. Maybe someone who can help. Logan looked down at his oatmeal, stirring it slowly with his spoon. I don't think so, he said after a pause. Dad had a friend named Mr. Russ, but I don't know where he lives. He used to visit us a long time ago. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's okay, Logan. We'll figure this out together. But for now, we need to make sure you and Charlie have a safe place to stay tonight. She thought about calling social services, but the idea felt too cold, too sudden. Margaret wanted Logan to feel secure, not scared or overwhelmed. Instead, she decided to take things one step at a time. She would call her friend Clara, who worked at a nearby community center and had a heart as big as the sky. Clara always had connections and knew how to help families in need. As Margaret reached for her phone, Charlie let out a small, curious coo. His big brown eyes looked up at her, and she couldn't help but smile. You're a strong little guy, aren't you? She said softly, brushing a finger against his tiny hand. Logan watched her, his expression a mix of hope and fear. Are you going to leave us, madam? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's heart clenched. She leaned closer to him and shook her head firmly. No, sweetheart, I'm not going to leave you. I promise, she said, her voice steady and warm. You're not alone anymore. She dialed Clara's number, and after a few rings, a cheerful voice answered on the other end. Margaret, what a surprise to hear from you. How are you? Clara, I need your help, Margaret said, keeping her voice low. I have two little ones here who need a safe place tonight. It's a long story, but I think they are in serious trouble. There was a brief pause before Clara responded, her tone filled with concern. "Bring them to the community center. We'll figure everything out. You know I'll do whatever I can." Relief washed over Margaret. "Thank you, Clara. I'll be there soon." She hung up and looked at Logan. "I have a friend who's going to help us, Logan. We'll go see her, and she'll make sure you and Charlie are safe." Logan nodded, though his grip on the edge of the table tightened. "Okay," he said softly. Margaret gathered their things, wrapping Charlie snugly in the blanket Logan had brought. As they stepped out of the cafe, the cool wind brushed against their faces. Margaret held Charlie close while Logan clutched her hand tightly. The walk to the community center wasn't far, but every step felt heavy with uncertainty. Margaret knew this was just the beginning of their journey, and she had no idea what challenges lay ahead. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let go of these boys no matter what. Margaret, holding Charlie tightly and guiding Logan by the hand, arrived at the community center just as the streetlights flickered on. The building stood tall and welcoming, its windows glowing softly against the darkening sky. A cheerful sign by the entrance read, "Greenville Community Center, a place for everyone." Clara was waiting for them just inside the doors. She was a warm-looking woman in her 50s, with curly gray hair and kind, twinkling eyes. She greeted Margaret with a quick hug before crouching down to Logan's level. "And who do we have here?" Clara asked gently, her voice calm and soothing. Logan hesitated, shrinking back slightly. Margaret knelt beside him and squeezed his shoulder. "This is Logan, and this little guy is Charlie," she said, shifting the baby in her arms. "They've been through a lot." Clara nodded with understanding. "Well, Logan, Charlie, you're safe now. Let's get you something warm to drink and a comfy place to sit." "Let's get you something warm to drink and a comfy place to sit." Clara led them to a cozy room filled with colorful chairs and shelves of books and toys. A soft rug covered the floor, and Logan's eyes widened as he took in the space. Margaret set Charlie down on the rug, propping him up with a soft cushion. The baby let out a small giggle, the first sound of joy Margaret had heard from him. While Clara fetched some hot chocolate for Logan, Margaret sat beside him on the rug. "See? This is a nice place, isn't it?" she said, smiling. Logan nodded but still looked unsure. "Are we going to stay here forever?" he asked quietly. "No, sweetheart," Margaret said gently. "This is just a stop while we figure out the next steps. Clara knows a lot of people who can help us find the right place for you and Charlie. Somewhere you can feel safe and cared for." Clara returned with a steaming cup of cocoa for Logan and a small bottle of warm milk for Charlie. Logan sipped the cocoa slowly, his small hands wrapped around the cup. Charlie eagerly drank the milk, letting out little contented sounds. As they settled in, Margaret and Clara began to talk quietly about the next steps. "There's a family shelter not far from here," Clara explained. "They can provide a temporary home while we look for something more permanent. I'll contact them first thing in the morning." Margaret nodded, relief washing over her. But before she could reply, a loud knock echoed from the front of the center. Clara frowned and stood. "I'll be right back," she said, heading toward the door. Logan immediately tensed, putting his cup down and scooting closer to Margaret. "Who is it?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," Margaret assured him, though her heart raced with unease. She held Logan close and glanced at Charlie, who was happily babbling on the rug, unaware of the tension in the room. Moments later, Clara returned, her expression serious. "Margaret," she said quietly, motioning for her to step aside. Margaret gently squeezed Logan's hand and whispered, "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll be right back." She followed Clara into the hallway, her mind swirling with questions. "It's a man," Clara said in a low voice, her eyes flicking toward the front door. "He says he's the boy's father." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as Clara's words sank in. "The boy's father?" she whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. Clara nodded, but added cautiously, "He seems distressed. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but we need to be careful. He's asking to see his sons." Margaret's thoughts swirled as she glanced back toward the room where Logan and Charlie were. Logan had said his father hadn't come back for them. Could this really be him? And if it was, why now? Why had he left them alone for so long? "Did he show any proof that he's their father?" Margaret asked in a hushed tone. Clara shook her head. "No, but he knows their names and some details. It's possible he's telling the truth, but I wanted to talk to you first before letting him inside." Margaret's heart ached. If this man truly was Logan and Charlie's father, they had a right to see him. But she couldn't ignore the fear in Logan's eyes whenever he mentioned being left behind. "Let me talk to Logan," Margaret said. "We need to handle this delicately." Clara agreed, staying by the front entrance while Margaret returned to the room. She found Logan sitting close to Charlie, who was now playing with a soft toy Clara had left for him. Logan looked up as Margaret walked in, his face clouded with worry. "Logan, sweetheart," Margaret began, kneeling down beside him. "There's someone at the door who says he's your dad. He wants to see you and Charlie." Logan's eyes widened, and he immediately clutched Margaret's arm. "No!" he cried out, his voice trembling. "Please don't let him take us. He always leaves us. He always says he'll come back, but he doesn't." Margaret wrapped her arms around Logan, holding him close as he started to sob. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe here," she said softly. "No one is going to take you or Charlie unless we know it's the right thing for you. I promise." As she comforted Logan, Margaret's mind worked quickly. She needed to know more about this man before making any decisions. She looked over at Charlie, who seemed unaware of the tension in the room, happily gumming on the edge of his toy. "Logan, can you tell me more about your dad?" Margaret asked gently once his tears began to subside. "I want to make sure we do what's best for you and Charlie." Logan sniffled and wiped his eyes. He He used to be nice," he whispered, "but after Mom left, he got angry all the time. He would leave us for days. Sometimes he'd come back with food, but sometimes he wouldn't." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy with each word. "Thank you for telling me, Logan. I want you to know you're very brave for taking care of Charlie like you have." She stood up, her resolve hardening. She would not let anyone disrupt the fragile sense of security these boys had just begun to feel. Margaret returned to the hallway where Clara was waiting. "What do you think?" Clara asked, her voice low. Margaret took a deep breath. "We need to talk to him," she said. "But I want Logan to stay here with Charlie. He doesn't feel safe, and I don't want to push him." Clara nodded and led Margaret toward the front entrance. As they approached, Margaret caught sight of the man through the glass door. He was tall and thin, his clothes rumpled and his face pale. There was an edge of desperation in his posture, and his hands fidgeted nervously. Margaret opened the door slightly, enough to speak but not to invite him inside. "Hello," she said firmly. "I'm Margaret. I'm with Logan and Charlie. Who are you?" The man's eyes darted between her and Clara. "I'm their dad," he said quickly. "I've been looking for them. Please, I need to see my boys." Margaret studied him carefully, searching for any sign of sincerity or danger. Why did you leave them? She asked, her voice steady but stern. The man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. I, I didn't mean to. Things got hard after their mom left, he admitted. I had to find work. I thought they'd be okay for a little while. But then I lost track of time. I, I came back, and they were gone. Please, I just want to make things right. Margaret exchanged a glance with Clara, who looked just as uncertain as she felt. The man's words sounded heartfelt, but could she trust him? And even if she could, what would Logan think? Margaret stood in the doorway, her grip tightening on the edge of the door. The man claiming to be Logan and Charlie's father shifted nervously, his words tumbling out in fragments of apology and regret. Margaret's heart was torn. She wanted to believe him, to give him the chance to reunite with his sons. But the fear in Logan's eyes and the stories of abandonment weighed heavily on her mind. Taking a deep breath, Margaret made her decision. I'll let you see your sons, but on one condition, she said firmly. We're not rushing into anything. Your boys need stability, not uncertainty. The man nodded quickly, his eyes glistening with desperation. Thank you, he said softly, his voice cracking. Margaret glanced at Clara, who nodded in quiet support. Together they led the man to the room where Logan and Charlie were. Logan froze the moment his father stepped inside, his hands trembling as he clutched his baby brother's blanket. Logan, the man said, his voice shaking, I've messed up. I'm so sorry. He knelt down, his eyes level with his son's. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Logan's gaze darted to Margaret, then to his father, and finally back to Charlie. Slowly he spoke, his voice barely audible. You always say that, and then you leave. The man's face crumpled in sorrow. I know, he whispered, but I'm not leaving this time. I promise. Margaret felt the weight of the moment, the delicate balance of trust and pain. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Logan's shoulder. It's okay to feel unsure, Logan, she said softly. We're going to take this one step at a time. Over the next few hours, with Clara's guidance, they began to unravel the tangled emotions and fears that filled the room. The man, whose name was David, opened up about his struggles and the mistakes he had made. Margaret and Clara listened carefully, offering measured responses and insisting that the boys' well-being had to come first. By the end of the evening, a tentative plan was in place. David would work with the community center to rebuild trust with his sons, attending counseling sessions and proving his commitment over time. Logan and Charlie would stay in a safe, nurturing environment, surrounded by support, until they felt ready to reunite fully. As Margaret tucked Logan and Charlie in for the night at the shelter, she whispered, You're both so brave. Remember, you're never alone. We'll keep making sure everything gets better. Logan smiled faintly, holding on to Charlie's tiny hand. Margaret watched as the two brothers drifted to sleep, the faint glow of hope lighting their faces. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to see it through, step by step. And so, the story closes with hope for healing, leaving the rest of their journey in the hands of time and care. Thank you for embarking on this heartfelt tale with me. Let me know if you'd like to start a new story or explore another creative direction.